Oh, welcome. Welcome to Bloom, a place where we want to inspire you to be an empowered version of yourself and create meaningful impact in the world. So, welcome, Courtney. It is a pleasure to have you on my show. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation because there are so many important things here for highly sensitive people and their nervous system. And you've studied it so deeply. So I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. I am too. I'm really excited to be here and thank you for the invitation to speak.
Wonderful. So let's dive right in. So you are an Ayurvedic practitioner and a health coach,
Mhm.
and you combine the wisdom and science of Ayurveda with somatic healing, which I find very intriguing because it is dealing with trauma of all kinds from a very, very old system that's grown over, thousands of years, and a very relatively new method of dealing with trauma. And I know that your path, your path for yourself in terms of a highly sensitive person and a high achiever and someone who had, um, has had physical problems by having putting too much pressure on yourself. And in a way, your own life is a testimony to the transformational power of your own work. So it's come out of your own life experience. And I'd love for you to, for us to show us or draw maybe some examples of your own life and how you got to build the system that you now so successfully use with yourself and other people. So over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Yes, so I practice Ayurvedic medicine and have been doing so for about 15 years. And I came into that experience through my own health crisis in my late 20s, which, although that was very challenging, I also see it for the blessing that it was. And it was until probably about the last 4 or 5 years that I started doing deeper work with somatic experiencing, which is the practice of supporting the nervous system to become more regulated and to release trauma. Sometimes we think of trauma as like the big T events, but sometimes it's just those small events that our nervous system can't fully digest and move through. So, um, for me, as I said, it was that kind of pinnacle moment of my chronic fatigue breakdown in my late 20s. But I think the trajectory of my life was more, looking back, I think that I was always this very kind of driven and high achieving child. I did tend to excel at a lot when I was younger and really was quite mature for my age. So in some ways I felt, I know we had talked before, like, how did you feel different? I think one of the ways that I felt different was that I looked mature. I acted very mature and I did excel a lot at a young age. And I don't say that to kind of brag about it, but that was a way in which I felt like there was a little bit of difference myself when I was younger. But I also had this deep sensitivity and empathy. And I think that I really struggled with the idea. And I also had this kind of sense of sensing the subtleties and the unseen in the world, which at the time I couldn't really, place what that was. But I know that I really struggled with the idea of suffering, which became stronger as I got older. Just this idea of like, those perfectionist tendencies couldn't see the world and see the suffering and be like, okay with that. Um, and so, I went through periods of life where I was really driven and pushing myself and then would kind of crash. And then as I became older after college, went into social work and academia with this intention of really making the world a better place and helping people. And it was through my own burnout that I realized like, oh, I'm trying to fix things outside of myself. And
Mm.
and I really, how do I want to be helping people? So I was forced inward. I was forced to do this work because as a, 26, 27-year-old in my apartment in San Francisco, barely able to walk down the street. I had been practicing yoga for several years at that point, but I still really couldn't even practice yoga in the same way. And so I was forced to find a different way. And it was through that experience that I got myself well enough to go to a yoga teacher training, and someone came to speak to us about Ayurveda. And it made absolute sense to me. It was made sense to me about how my body worked. I got that like full body yes of like, this is it. And at the time, I actually had an opportunity to go get my PhD at like my dream university. And I actually turned it down prior, like about a year prior to discovering Ayurveda, because my whole system was like, this isn't it. So I think that sensitivity and that intuition at the time, it seemed crazy that I was saying no to this, but it allowed me to just give myself like a year to just sit with what do I need? You know, what is my deeper dharma and my purpose? And that's when Ayurveda came into my life. And almost immediately I started to feel my body be nourished in a completely different way. And I remember my first consultation was after going to so many doctors and even a lot of holistic practitioners, going to an Ayurvedic practitioner who was a student at the time. And she sat with me for like the first 2-hour consultation. And she said, everything you're feeling makes sense. All your symptoms make sense from the perspective of Ayurveda. And there's something you can do about it. And just to hear that in and of itself was healing. And so I started to make these small changes with my diet. And she put me on some digestive herbs and some mind herbs. And my system just immediately started to shift and change. So that was pretty much it for me. That was over 15 years ago. And I realized through that how I wanted to help the world was to teach people how to get back into their bodies, how to listen to the language that their body speaks to them, how to be empowered to know what to do about it. And in doing so, that cascades out into what we bring into the world. So trying to fix the world just externally wasn't the way for me, and that I really needed to teach people individually how to work on their inner self.
Yeah, and you do that individually, but you also do it in groups. So maybe later we can return to this aspect of your work.
Yeah.
I think there's been already so much in there that many highly sensitives can relate to. This, confusion of the body, this, and in your case, you showed really well what happens when you start trusting your intuition, when you make room for that, when you get out of this treadmill of saying, I need to fulfill something that will prove that I'm worthy. I remember this PhD topic is a huge thing in my life as well. And, I started one and then I left. And for years, I sort of told myself that I was so stupid that I preferred dancing to doing a PhD. And I tried a second time later until I realized, and it didn't work because I was between too many chairs. People said, yeah, that's very interesting, but also typical HSP, until I said, what's going on here? Why do I think I need this to prove something to myself or to the world? And I find that in many of my clients that there's a confusion inside about what you said. What do I need? What do I want? What is my mission? What is sort of pulling me, not pushing me? And what is pushing me? What is in the outside? You said that so well. Outside, what do I want to be there and prove there? And what does the inside of me actually want? And again, I think you said it so well, that needs a certain relationship with your body. It needs a body that you can actually listen to. And I wrote down this quote, you have that on your homepage, where it says, if your body confuses you, you are not alone. And I would say that 95% of all neurosensitives I know are really, really confused about their body and about their symptoms and about even feeling safe in their own body. So how can you listen to your intuition if you don't feel safe in your body? So, and that interpretation of the signal. So can you sort of explain a little bit more to us what that means also in terms of your work, how you teach people?
Yeah, I think, well, first I want to say that there's so much discussion around like intuition or kind of these esoteric, intangible concepts, which I am all about, like, the subtle kind of spiritual realm. But I think, for me, what I really needed was, how do I make this practical? Like, how do I ground this in my day-to-day lived experience and in my body and understand what's going on in my body? And so for me, Ayurveda and Somatic Experiencing have really given me that framework and that structure. So I'll just share a little bit about like what that means to listen to the language your body speaks and how to interpret those symptoms or those signals of misalignment.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately those symptoms and signals are trying to get us back to this place of more integration, a way in which we're living our lives in more integrity and authenticity and alignment. So, so in Ayurveda, Ayurveda is based on the five elements theory, which is that everything is composed of these five elements. They're grouped into what we call the doshas, which are like these humors, these forces of nature that carry out and create the structure of the physical body. So there's Vata dosha, which is air space element, Pitta dosha, which is fire and a little bit of water, and then Kapha dosha, which is water and earth. And so we all have all three of those. We can tend to have a predominance, which means we will have tendencies similar to the qualities of those elements. So when one of those doshas gets out of balance, we will have symptoms. And when we are highly sensitive, oftentimes we will have a predominance of Vata, Vata dosha, which is the air space element, and sometimes Pitta dosha. Mm-hmm. And so when we start, symptoms such as anxiety. So Vata is air space element. It's fast moving. It's ungrounded. Anxiety is also like that. The nature of anxiety is that there's fast moving thoughts. There is, it's an ungrounded mind. So when we start to observe our mind and say, it's not the content of the story in our mind, it's the quality of our thoughts. And we can notice, okay, I feel really anxious right now. I feel spacey. I feel ungrounded. It's telling me that my Vata is high, and through like increases, like opposites balance, through opposites, I can bring in through my senses, through what I eat, through my lifestyle, through all these different practices, I can bring in those opposite qualities into my being and help to ground and stabilize what's become excessive. Mm-hmm. And it applies to all the different doshas. So we start to, and we can also, there's so much overlap between Ayurveda and somatic experiencing. Another way to frame that anxiety is my nervous system is in a sympathetic response, that fight or flight response. Anxiety is the flight response. So my system is like literally trying to run from something that it can't. And so it's in that fear and anxiety. And so we can look at it, instead of saying it's the story, we're looking at the state. And all of that gives us information about how to read the signals our body is sending to us. And when you learn the tools, which is what I teach to people, you know what to do in that moment. And it's telling you, I am not these thoughts. I am not these symptoms. These symptoms are a sign of dysregulation or imbalance, but who I am is actually something much deeper. So I think that's the best way that I could explain that.
Super. Very interesting. So in a way, it says you are not broken, you are just dysregulated. Your sensitivity is not a problem if you know how to ground. Do you understand that correctly?
Yeah. And I think, we're all humans. So sometimes people think of balance as like the static state that we get to, but we are humans moving through life, we go out of balance through what we take in through our senses. Too much of a certain thing is going to create imbalance. So that's the reality of living in a human body. So we will all go through states of some imbalance in different times. The way in which a more highly sensitive person, Vata is related to the nervous system. So we may have a tendency to have more sensitive nervous systems. Or, the gift is that we're more connected to that kind of subtle realm. And the challenge is that we need to be able to stay grounded in this world. Vata travels, Vata's windy. So it's like you could have one symptom here and then another symptom there and this symptom there and this symptom there. So, but one of my teachers said early on, the gift of having high Vata or Vata in your constitution is that you have to learn early on how to take care of yourself. Someone who has more natural stamina and stability, like a Kapha type, is not going to necessarily have to learn early on, because they may have that resistance or that kind of resilience naturally, but down the line, they may kind of struggle because when it hits the fan, so to speak, like they may not have those skills. Whereas when you're, and I do think that when coming back to my story, I think that was my gift. Even though I'm not Vata predominant, that's what tends to kind of go out of balance for me, as it does for most people. Like 90% of imbalances are Vata. So I had to learn early on, this is how I take care of myself, not only so that I don't suffer, but also so that I can channel my gifts, which they are gifts. And when I was younger, it felt like, suffering or more of a curse. And now I realize these are the Ayurveda and Somatic Experiencing. This is what I use to create that container and grounding in my system so that I can channel that intuition, that sensitivity, that empathy, even like those subtle psychic abilities. And I need that container in order to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So much in there. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I have so many questions. So would you say that, you said that the Vata type needs to learn to stabilize early on. And I would say that in our society, that is not taught. It doesn't happen for many of us. And that just like you, just like me, I also had my first burnout without actually knowing it in my late 20s. I think for many of us, and I see that in my clients, that sort of late 20s, beginning of 30s is a point where the body starts giving in. If we haven't learned to ground. So would you say that it would be very helpful if we as a society would actually learn more about how to help people that have a certain predominance in their nervous system pretty much early on, that there's an awareness for it?
So I think that comes to another piece talking about another dosha, which is Pitta dosha. So Pitta is the fire element. And so you live in Germany, right? And you also have Italian heritage. So those are two cultures that have a lot of Pitta naturally. American culture reveres Pitta, that idea of like being driven and pushing ourselves and kind of overriding, is a badge of honor. Like, look how little I can sleep and look how much I can produce. And that is a very Pitta quality. And the ones who burn out usually tend to have a lot of Pitta. I'm Pitta predominant. And the reason why is because there is a lot of outward moving energy and pushing energy, and there's not enough energy towards nourishment and rejuvenation and kind of inward moving energy. And that inherently kind of burns away what we call ojas in Ayurveda, OJAS, which is the container of our vital energy. It's what creates stability in our body and our mind. So the ones who burn out tend to be very Pitta predominant. And I think that there's the deepest piece around, and then there's a specific way in which this also impacts the hormonally female body as well, which I talk about a lot. How kind of living on those stress hormones will inevitably deplete our sex hormones and create hormonal imbalance and, kind of reduce that natural buffer and protection in the system. So I think, the biggest underlying piece is that our cultures often, at least in the US, values, our value is rooted in our productivity. And I think that's really like the underlying spiritual, work is like, can we find value in things other than how much we can produce and how much we can constantly be out in the world and be pushing ourselves and overriding ourselves? So I think really the lesson here is, how do we listen to the language that our body speaks to us and be able to honor those kind of, what's the word? When it sends us a signal, I need rest, I need food, I need to take a break, I need these things, instead of judging those, because we don't judge ourselves when we're thirsty, but when we need to rest, we're like, oh gosh, what's wrong with me, right? Like there must be something wrong. So when we're able to find more balance between those more kind of yang, to use the words from Chinese medicine, yang, kind of masculine, fiery, external energy, it's an externalizing energy, and the internal, more yin, feminine, rejuvenating, restorative energy. I think that's just a collective thing, right? Like it's not just certain types. It's going to be more predominant for certain types because they will naturally have more of that fiery kind of driven energy. But it's something that collectively, to be able to honor the yin, honor the feminine aspects of being, honor the need for rest and nourishment and pleasure, and not just have all of it be about, oh, we do this so that we can then be more productive. We do this because it's our divine right to be doing that. And that's just as much a part of life as it is to be productive and be pushing ourselves out into the world.
Yeah, again, so much in there. I mean, especially I think for HSPs, that need for integration and for peace and for what I call the sensitives way, which is, with, I don't know if that would fit your definition, but with less fire, but with not necessarily without power, but it's a different kind of power that comes out of a still place. Which again, as you say, in our society is not honored. There are other societies that honor that deeply, but Western society doesn't. And, we could have a long discussion about productivity because, again, especially in the United States and, in Germany is basically has become a clone of the United States. Productivity is measured in your output of something that can be counted, which is insane. So it's not necessarily about how many clients you can serve within a day, but it could be how many clients did I truly and honestly serve well today, which might bring you just as much financial rewards than the other one, but we're not taught about that. And I'd like to segue now, because you sort of put that in the room, and that is that intersection between the nervous system and the hormonal system. And I know you work predominantly with women, so if you want to expand on that, because from my own life I know how warped that can get if you try and live like a man, which I did for a very long time. So
and I think, as I said, my minor was in gender studies. So when I got my graduate degree, so there was always this curiosity for me, this like exploration around that. And I do really believe, there were things that we needed to do in order to access resources and power. And I think what we're seeing now is this kind of awareness of what's happened to our bodies as a result of this, and not to look back and go, oh, that was bad, that was wrong, but to say, what's the next level of evolution here? How can we find even greater balance? And so I think, looking at the hormones and the nervous system through the lens, or the hormones, at least through the lens of Eastern medicine, has been really profound for me. My teacher, Dr. Claudia Welch, wrote a really amazing book called Balance Your Hormones, Balance Your Life, and really revolutionized how I saw all my patients and myself. And really, essentially, it's that we have Western medicine tends to look at the hormones kind of individually and what they're doing and how we can fix each of them individually. Eastern medicine looks at them, how they're interacting with each other. So if you think of that yin yang symbol in the hormonally female body, we have our sex hormones and our stress hormones. I'll start with stress hormones. So those are more of the kind of what we call yang or masculine hormones. They serve a purpose. They're related to the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system, but they're what gets us up and active and going. And the one that is most important for this conversation is cortisol, which tends to stay in the system longer. It's the most depleting hormone. Again, it has a lot of positive action. When we have excess cortisol, it can be very depleting to the system. And then on the other hand, we have our sex hormones of estrogen and progesterone. So progesterone, estrogen is kind of the juiciest, most like feminizing hormone, and progesterone less so. Progesterone kind of keeps estrogen in check, will help to produce more if we need more, and will buffer too much growth from estrogen. So what the pattern that I see is that when we are running on stress energy, which so many women are mistaking stress energy for real energy, real deeply sourced energy. So we're running on the stress energy. Our nervous system is giving our system the message, you are under threat. So whether it's, and it may like may really be legitimate threatening life circumstances, or may it be as a result of experiencing trauma where our system feels like it's constantly in a state of needing to, that it's under threat, or it could be our to-do list, our calendar, all of our responsibilities, the fact that we're juggling work and family and, maintaining a home and so forth, that our nervous system is getting the signal that it needs to keep pumping out these stress hormones. And what happens with cortisol is that over time, it takes less and less of a stress trigger for the system to say, okay, I need to crank out more of the stress hormones. So our buffer for that stress response gets lowered. And then here's the biggest piece. Progesterone is made in the same pathway as that stress hormone.
Oh, really?
So the body will always choose survival over reproduction. So I'll say that again. The body will always choose survival over reproduction. Let's think about this really practically. Like if you are in a campsite and a bear comes into your campsite, you're not like, let me just go eat this meal over here, which is more parasympathetic, like yin aspect of the nervous system, the rest and digest. Let me go like procreate. Like it's not thinking about doing those things. It's saying, I need to survive this moment before I can do anything else. So it's going to get into that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system and start pumping out those stress hormones, which are going to go to your arms and your legs. It's going to take it away from the visceral organs so that it can do what it needs to do. And when we're constantly getting that message, it's going to continually pull from the production of progesterone, which then cascades into hormone imbalance. So it's either going to deplete progesterone, which then can also deplete estrogen or create estrogen dominance. Estrogen can kind of create too much growth. So when I started learning about that, it was like, oh, this makes so much sense now. And it cascades through the endocrine system. So it affects our adrenals. It starts affecting the insulin producing portion of the pancreas. That's when we get that belly fat that we can't get rid of no matter how much we work out. It starts affecting the thyroid and the ovaries as well. And it's not just reproductive health or endocrine issues. It really can just be a myriad of symptoms that we're noticing in our body. And so we can see how those two branches are also related to the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, which is also the action. Sympathetic kind of gets that like negative connotation that it's just fight or flight, but it's the active part, like getting moving part of the nervous system. And then the parasympathetic, which is the freeze response or also the rest and digest response. So when we get, the more activated we get, if we can't fight or flee, our system will just kind of freeze. And that's when we start seeing procrastination, depression, chronic fatigue, those sorts of things. So, but go ahead.
I'm sorry, but you can also, I find this really fascinating. But from my experience, you can also, because I also work with a lot of trauma, you can get both. You can get people oscillating absolutely. From one to the other and then end up completely confused, saying, like you said, you have all this myriad of symptoms and it's like a forest you can't find your way out of. And you go to one practitioner and another practitioner and another practitioner. And because they don't talk to each other or the systems are wildly different, you keep returning to, I'm so confused about my body and I can't find a way out of this overwhelm no matter what I do. And I think what you describe now is so beautiful, because as you told me, so it was such a relief for you to finally have a system that also explains the connection of all these myriads of symptoms and actually gives you a handrail on how to begin to regulate. To me, it's always like a mobile. You change something on the right side and you don't realize that something at the bottom left side is also out of whack, but it's actually connected. So just please go on. I just wanted to sort of
No, I think that's absolutely true. And then you start to notice the rhythms that your body is moving through. Like, one thing for me was I had to notice when my system started running on stress energy. And what were those signals? I could start to feel that my system was running in a different way. And that was the sign for me to pull back and then I needed rest. If we don't know what that feels like, we're just going to keep pushing. We're going to keep overriding. And then our system's flooded with stress hormones. I think to really simplify, and this is what I always hold on to, the root cause of the vast majority of women's health issues is trying to do more than our system has the capacity for. coupled with not enough physical and emotional nourishment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's really looking at those two branches of the hormones and the nervous system. So we have to work on building that capacity in our system, and understanding our own unique needs for nourishment, which I think Ayurveda really does. It looks at, what is your specific constitution? How are you unique? What do you need? And ultimately, the greatest source of nervous system regulation and energy is going to be our connection to nature. So how we move more with nature's rhythms, because when we're moving against those rhythms, our circadian rhythm, our seasonal rhythms, even like our monthly menstrual cycle or the time of life that we're in, it's going to create more stress in the nervous system. So the thing that I found to be most profound has been to learn to live in that more rhythmic way, which as a hormonally female, a woman, that is how we're designed. And I do think that is like the next iteration of our evolution, is recognizing we're not linear. Our bodies are not linear. They're not as linear as the male body. So much of our research and science has been based on the male body. I think it was the 1990s in the US where they actually started including women in studies, because it's too unpredictable with all these hormones. So to recognize that we actually access much greater and deeper vitality and power and stability in our body and our mind when we learn to live in rhythm and we learn to understand how our body needs to be uniquely nourished, based on this connection to nature, versus suppressing, medicalizing, overriding, pathologizing, which is what, if you listen to the language around, periods and childbirth and menopause, there's so much negativity around it that we've all really ingrained, I think, on a deep level.
Yeah, and
Something
fear.
to suffer through rather than having it be these experiences of life that allow us to access this deep power, essentially, and wisdom.
Yeah, it's ingrained with fear, and I think possibly on purpose.
Yes.
Especially
Yeah.
also, menopause. And I was lucky in that way because my mother, when she was at that point, she said, "Oh, finally, I don't have to deal with bleeding
Yeah.
anymore." And she was like, "Thank God."
Yeah.
So I had a very good template for somebody who did not feel that they lost their femininity. She just said, I'm free to do other things now. I'm free to enjoy certain things, without having to worry. So,
Yeah.
And that is empowering rather than saying, "Oh my God, if I go into menopause, I'm not worth anything anymore." Just, it's just not very useful thought, but very common. But what I also thought while you were talking is that a lot of what you say, I think, goes for highly sensitives, even if they're men, because they also need to have a different rhythm with their own body and energy system than somebody who is, for lack of a better word, more linear, or has a more stable nervous system. And many of them then think, "Oh, I'm a sissy." Yeah, because I can't be this guy who's always strong and calm and productive. And I think there's a huge lesson here. Also, you mentioned the yin and yang, how much is our system by nature able to do, and not necessarily label that as feminine or masculine, but I don't know, what kind of words would you choose to describe that different balance that HSP men might have?
Well, the way that it was described for me, I just did a workshop, or took a workshop on, it was on male puberty. And it was from someone who was intersex, hormonally intersex. And so, and he identifies as a male. So he was saying how he was kind of uniquely in this position to talk about this because he knows what it feels like to have these different hormones flowing through his body. And he describes it, he calls it masculine and feminine, but he said it's really an outward moving energy and an inward moving energy. And I think that's kind of the essence of it. Like, how much do we equate being productive with how much we put out into the world. But in my experience, the times where I'm most creative, the times where I get the most inspiration, the times where I what actually fuels my work is not always when I'm sitting down to try to crank information out. It's when I give myself that space and when I tend to myself so that I have that clarity in my system, and that it's coming from a place of much more integration and alignment. in yoga and Ayurveda, we talk about these kind of 5 layers of being called the koshas. So we have our physical body, our energetic body, like the Russian doll. The outward is the physical body, then the energetic breath body, then the mind, then the intuitive wisdom body, and then the deepest level is the soul. And all these practices are really working on creating a deeper connection and integration between those things. So we work with the physical body because it's the most tangible. We work with breath work because that's very tangible. And then they start to impact our mind and our access to our intuition and our soul. And if we're constantly outward focused, we are going to lose that connection. And it may be someone's dharma to just really be out in the world and to be much more physical. And maybe they've been gifted that physical stamina to be able to do that. And for some of us, it might be more about that deeper, intuitive spiritual work. And this is what we need to tend to ourselves in order to access that.
Yeah, and that it's not useful to label that as powerful, non-powerful, male, female, or whatever, because that actually interferes with that label-free expression.
Absolutely, yeah.
I would, considering the time, just very briefly like to touch on, because we haven't talked about somatic experiencing a lot. And, somatic experiencing has a lot to do with trauma and how to overcome traumatic patterns deeply rooted in our body. And it's also part of my work. And I'd love to just spend a little bit of time on the intersection between the trauma work that you do there, the hormonal system. I mean, it's a huge thing to sort of try and cover in a few minutes. Yeah. And what the things you explained about personality patterns. Let's just briefly dip into that.
Well, I guess I'll speak more to how I work with it, which is that I work first with the Ayurveda. I incorporate it all, but I really focus on that first because I think it's bringing ourselves back into the physical body in a way that feels, manageable, because when we've experienced trauma, sometimes being in the body can feel overwhelming. Absolutely. And so it's a way to subtly kind of bring ourselves back into embodiment and really digest, because so much of Ayurveda is like strengthening our not only physical digestion, but also those like the subtle digestion in our body to digest our experiences. And so it allows for that digestion of the stuff that our system hasn't been able to fully process. And then as we are more anchored in that, in our bodies, we're able to go more into those subtle practices, the somatic practices of, recognizing the sensations and the emotions and the thought patterns and, even image and movement, and how to, be in a practice where maybe we're in a negative headspace, but we're able to allow ourselves to just pendulate to something that feels neutral or positive and build that capacity through that. So I guess that's how, as briefly as I can say, how I work with it. It really is all just about embodiment, getting back into the body and learning to honor and understand how to interpret those signals that our body's sending us.
I love this idea too, which is so foundational to trauma therapies, to say, first we need to build a base so that the body and the emotional system, or I mean the whole person, can actually tolerate to digest whatever happened, rather than sort of diving in. And from the way you combine things, it makes perfect sense to say, I'm just going to build up the nervous system and the hormonal system and the body resources in a way that enables my client to have that grounding in the body to actually deal with the heavier emotions.
Yeah. And I think of it as like kind of this metaphor that I just feel is really profound to think about, which is, we call her Mother Nature for a reason, right? When a baby doesn't know how to regulate their own emotions and nervous system, they need regulated adults around them to help to mirror that and to stabilize them. And it's the same way when we are in states of imbalance or trauma. When we lean into this abundance, and Mother Nature is always trying to nourish us, when we lean into that wisdom and that abundance through, how we're eating, through how we're sleeping, through how we're moving through our day, through these other practices, that connect us to that, it's like leaning into, our creator, the mother, to help to stabilize our system so that we can help to process and heal those things. And that feels like a very real lived thing for me, in my body at this point. I feel that on a really cellular level.
Beautiful. Very beautiful.
Thank you.
So my last question is always, is there something I did not ask you that you would like to bring to this conversation?
I feel like we covered so much in a really fluid way. I think it would just be that, especially for HSPs, that I it took me a while to understand the gift, and I wouldn't have it any other way. That my dharma was this path, and to live that so I can help other people to understand that. And I don't think that I would choose it any differently. So, and the body has such an incredible power to heal itself. It truly, truly does. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've experienced it myself. And when we learn this language that our body speaks to us, it's like the path back. The path back. So we just have to learn to understand how to interpret that.
So it's a message of hope.
Absolutely.
You can heal, you can learn to calibrate, and you can learn to move into your gifts rather than being stuck with the dysregulation and the myriad of symptoms. So I really, really like that as a conclusion, to say there is hope and there is purpose maybe to our path. And there is the power to build our vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's tools. There are tools out there that have been with us for thousands of years, and they're with us because they are so resilient and adaptable.
Very important point, because this fear of not finding the tools to get out of that dysregulated place keeps so many of us busy looking and searching and trying out yet again, and always ending up with this feeling of, well, I can't be fixed. So I really, really appreciate that, and thank you for bringing this to this community.
Well, thank you for inviting me to do so. I love sharing it. It's the most important thing.
That's your mission, sharing this and working with people. So really wonderful.
Well, thank you.
So I always find the end a bit difficult if I have a wonderful discussion, but so thank you very much for this. And I'm sure we'll keep up this conversation at different points.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.